Let me introduce you to a new area of our journey into Kodshim, the area of leftovers, Shfichat HaShirayim al Yesod, Zevachim Daf Lamed Tes Amud Aleph. In the amazing workbook for spiritual growth, the Chovat HaVavot by Rabbi Bechaya ibn Pekuda, he talks in Shar Cheshbon HaNefesh, towards the end of the third parak, about the fact that we have not only physical eyes, but we have an eye in our heart as well. The heart is capable of seeing, and that as one develops growth, spiritual growth, intellectual growth, understanding of the Torah, we develop the capacity to see not only with our physical eyes, but to actually see with a different part of our being, to be able to see with our hearts, and to be able to see things which are not otherwise visible. Taking that understanding, one of the things we need to be able to do is to see people and things not only as they are, and not only as they could be, but also as they could have been. Because what a person or a thing, but let's talk about people, could have been, also defines who they are at their essence. We get very excited when a baby's born and we think of all the potential of what this baby could grow up to be, who this infant could grow up to be. And then sometimes we encounter people who have become dissipated and have lost that potential which was never fully developed. You might meet a homeless person and feel the tragedy of his or her situation. It's important, even when you see such an unfortunate human being, to realize that there's not a whole lot that you're seeing in their presence. There's not a whole lot of potential that you're identifying in them, but you need to also be able to look at them as whom they could have been, because whom they could have been is also part of whom they are. Who each one of us could have been is part of who we are. We carry that potential within us, and we'll extract these principles and understand them from this amazing piece of Gemara where we look at leftovers. The term Shirayim, which we have in Kodshim, Shirayim means leftovers. That's exactly what it means. And there are whole sugyas in Kodshim about leftovers. Yes, we're talking about leftovers on the Mizbeach, but as with everything else in Kodshim, we're learning how to apply those principles to our day-to-day life as well. And leftovers have a hidden status, which we don't appreciate. And hopefully, as we get into this new area of Kodshim, we'll begin to appreciate that nuanced, hidden status of a leftover. To do that, we need to go through a number of psukim. We need to understand some of the psukim. So in Vayikra, it starts off telling us about a korban olah, the burnt offering. Then it moves on to a korban mincha, the flour offering in its different forms. It goes through all the different types. And then to a korban shlomim, to the voluntary korbanos. And then it comes on to the korban chatas, the korban that is brought to atone for sin. And it has different categories. What happens if a Kohen Gadol has sinned? What happens if the Sanhedrin has sinned? What happens if the king has sinned? And what happens if an ordinary Jew has sinned? So we have these 4 different categories of korban chatos. For the first time, other than in the Miluim earlier in Sefer Shmos, for the first time we're introduced to the idea of shfichas domim, of pouring the leftover blood out in the korban chatat. Now remember, the korban chatat has a need to do how many sprinklings? Do you remember? 4 proper ones, not 2 that are 4 full ones on each of the corners of the Mizbeach. So with the Kohen Gadol, the Torah tells us in Pasuk Zayin in Perek Daled, Ve'et kol adam yishpoch et Mizbeach Hashem. After you've sprinkled blood around the corners, you pour the blood onto the foundation of the Mizbeach. The Mizbeach had a kind of a step at the bottom, around part of the Mizbeach, so along the west side of the Mizbeach and the north side of the Mizbeach, and just one amah of the east side and one amah of the south side, just around the corner, there was a step by the ground. So you have the ground of the Beis Hamikdash, and you've got this little step, which is an amah high and about an amah wide, and then the Mizbeach is built on top of that. That, the Yesod, as it's called, is designed for the purpose of shfichas domim. It doesn't have another purpose. The reason for it is to pour the leftover blood onto the Yesod of the Mizbeach. And it's interesting because there was another place to dispose of blood. There was a gutter that ran through the Azora and it went out eventually into the river, and it was used for fertilizing, and as we're told in the Mishnahs and in the Gemara. But the Yesod is different. The Yesod had 2 drains on the southwest side of the Mizbeach, corner of the Mizbeach, and each of those drains took the blood down into the bowels of the earth under the Mizbeach. So this was something quite special. So in the case of the Kohen Gadol, after you sprinkled the blood, where does the Kohen Gadol sprinkle the blood? On which, if it's a sin offering for a Kohen Gadol, where does he sprinkle the blood? On the Mizbeach HaPnimi, on the inside Mizbeach. In the Heichal was the small Mizbeach used for Ktoret, and on that Mizbeach is where he spilt. Then he would come outside of the Heichal, and he would face the Mizbeach, the big Mizbeach, and that's where he would spill the rest of the blood. So the first one is he sprinkles on the Mizbeach Asher Ba'ohel Moed. Vet kol dam hapar yishpoch el yesod Mizbeach ha'olah. The Mizbeach ha'olah is the outside, the big altar. If the Sanhedrin in the next Pasuk Yud Ches, if the Sanhedrin sins, same thing. They sprinkle on the inside, Vet kol adam yishpoch el yesod Mizbeach ha'olah. Then we come to the Nasi. If the king sins, then v'natan al kanot mizbach ha'olah, he sprinkles on the corners of the outer mizbach, of the big mizbach, not inside. So there's a pnim and there's a chutz. Some is done inside, some is done outside. The Nasi is done outside, ve'etamo yishpoch yesod mizbach ha'olah, and then he spills the blood once again. There's only one place to spill the blood, to pour the blood, and that's on the yesod of the mizbach ha'olah. And likewise, the Yochid, a single person, the difference between the first two and the second two is important. The first two, the Mishnah says in Eizim Chomen, we say it every morning, Kodshe Kadoshim. The Kodshe Kadoshim are those sacrifices that are taken inside the Beis HaMikdash. And they're sprinkled on the inside. But afterwards, Haya shofech al yesod ma'aravi shel mizbeach hachitzon. So he walked out of the Heichal, now he hits the Mizbeach. What side of the Mizbeach does he hit? The Heichal is on the western side of the Mizbeach. So as he walks out of the Heichal, he's standing in front of the western side of the Mizbeach. That's where he does the shvicha, on the western side. He doesn't walk around the corner. That's for the first and the second. The third and the fourth one, where the actual sprinkling is done on the Mizbeach itself, he's walking around the Mizbeach on the midway step of the Mizbeach, is walking around the Mizbeach, then he comes down the ramp. And he has to make a right turn when he comes down the ramp. What's the first side of the Mizbeach that he hits when he makes a right turn as he comes down of the ramp? The ramp's facing south. It's facing Eilat. I don't know why, but facing Eilat. And he comes down the ramp, and now he makes a right, and a right again, so he hits the south wall of the Mizbeach. That's where he does the shvicha. That's where he pours it there. Always the Mizbeach ha'olah, always the outer Mizbeach, always the Yesod. Sometimes on the west side, sometimes on the south side. That's the only difference. Shari Adam Yashofech al Yesod Droimis. The first Mishnah says al Mizbeach Achitza in the Yesod Ma'aravi on the west side, and in Mishnah Gimel al Yesod Droimis for the private chatos and the chatos of the king, it has to be done on the south side. Then in Parshas Re'eh in Dvorim, we have a general statement. And the blood of your korbanos should be poured out. Says Al Gemara 2 daf back on daf Lamed Zayin. It's not only the chatat. The only time we see in the Torah this idea of pouring out the blood onto the base of the Mizbeach are the 4 korban chatoses that we have. That's the only time we see it. So it says the Gemara on Daf Lamed Zayin, but it's not only for a korban chatos. So yes, for a korban chatos it's specified. But the dam zevachecha yishafech is lechol adamim shutuunim matan dam layesod. All korbanos need pouring of the blood onto the mizbeach, onto the yesod, which already introduces us to the fact that this is more than disposing of leftovers. There's something more that is required. It's not just that you may pour it out there, it's that you must pour it out there. Explains Rashi, shekol adamim shekol hakorbanot shetuni matan dam leyesod im nishar min adam bakli. If there's blood left over, you need to pour it out. And Tosfos says on Daf Nun Gimel, we'll have a lovely Tosfos on Daf Nun Gimel when we get there, talks about the difference of korban chatos, which was sprinkled with your finger, and some of the other korbanos which you sprinkled from the utensil. If you sprinkle from the utensil, it's possible by the time you finish sprinkling, there's nothing left. If you're using your fingers, there's definitely going to be something left. So that's by the korban chatos. So that's why the korban chatos, you'll definitely pour it out on the yesod. But says the Gemara here that im nishar min adam bekli, if one of the other korbanos have blood left over in the kli la'achar shezarak shtei matnotav, when you've done your 2 throwings, shetzarich l'shofcho la'yesod, you've got to pour that blood out on the yesod, not into the gutter. It's got to go into the Yesod. Even though we're only told the principle of pouring leftovers onto the Yesod for the sin offering, it applies to all offerings. Says Rashi. Now it gets a bit wild, and I'll try and simplify it. On our daf, Rabbi Nechemia says, Shiarei hadam sheikrivan b'chutz chayav. There are various dinim. One of them is kreva b'chutz. If you took the blood outside of the Beis Hamikdash and you sacrificed or did anything with them, threw them out there or whatever, chayav, there's an isukoros that you're not allowed to do. So you see that the shiarei hadam, the leftover blood, still has kedushat hadam. It still has the sanctity of the blood. You see in Rabbi Nechemia. On Daf Kuf Yud Aleph, we'll get there too. Rabbi Yochanan says, Tana Rabbi Nechemia kedivrei haomer shirayim ma'akvin. That's because Rabbi Nechemia holds, as we learnt in Ezu Mekoman, in the Mishnah that we quoted, that in Kodshei Kedoshim, im lo natan lo ikev, the Mishnah there says, if you didn't throw the blood out, it's not ma'akev, it doesn't cause a problem. But Rabbi Nechemia holds it does. Rabbi Nechemia holds that if you didn't do shfichat damim, if you didn't pour the blood out onto the Yesod, the whole korban is spilt. So Rabbi Nechemia elevates the leftover blood to a much higher level of kedusha, which we see both in the fact that if he didn't do it, it messes up the korban, and that if he does it outside, his chayav. And Rashi says, Hilkat avodahi litchayev alea b'chutz kish'ad zorek miktzat damim. Therefore, you can see that the pouring of blood is part of the avodah. It's not just something that you dispose of what's left over. It's part of the actual avodah, is to dispose of it correctly on the yesod of the mizbeach. Then there's a fascinating Tosfos, which we don't have time to go into in detail, but Rabbi Yaakov from the Alliance asks on our understanding of Rabbi Nechemia. He says, but we see from Rabbi Nechemia here that we're not only talking about the first two korban chatases, the ones which if you don't, which you do inside and then you have to come out and pour the blood. There we understand that if you didn't pour the blood, it's ma'akev, you've got a problem. You did the inner sacrifice, you did the inner korban, you come out and you don't pour the blood on the yesod. That's a problem. But we see that the Rabbi Nechemia is speaking also about the second two korban chatases, the ones that are done outside, where in any case you're sprinkling it on the corners of the outside mizbeach. So there, if you didn't do the final shvicha, you didn't pour it onto the yesod, it's not ma'akev, it's not so terrible. And even there, Rabbi Nechemia says, but if you take the blood outside, you're chayev. Says Rabbeinu Yaakov Mir Alliance, it seems that they're not connected, that there's something difficult going on there. Tosfos then explains that whether it's the inner or the outer, just as for the inner bloods, if you take it outside, you're chayev. Im ken yesh lechayev af bechitzonim af agav delo ma'akvi. Even though that outer pouring is not essential, if you missed it, you haven't spoiled the korban. Nevertheless, it's part of the avodah, and therefore, if you take that blood outside of the Beis Hamikdash, you're in real trouble. And so Tosfos says you don't have to link the two. You don't have to say it's holy. We know it's holy because if you didn't do it, you spoil the korban. No, if you didn't do it, you don't spoil the korban, and yet it's holy enough to be chayev that if you take it outside of the korban, you're in trouble. On the online version, I've printed out the whole shir of Rabbi David Lapin, but I didn't print it on your copy because we're not going through it word for word, but it's available for you to learn on, where he develops, based on his father's Torah, he develops the idea that this idea of shficha is part of zrika. So we know you've got to sprinkle the blood. You've got to sprinkle the blood on the four corners or on two of the four corners. And that's an important part of the avodah. We know from all the laws we've been learning about with pigul and bad thoughts that you've got while you're doing it. Sprinkling the blood is the kapora. It's the essential part of the korban, as we learned a couple of days ago. It's the korban itself, the sprinkling of the blood. Says Rabbi David Lapin, shficha is not the disposal of leftovers. It's part of the process of zrika, according to our Tosfos. It's part of the process of zrika. So let's just pause there. We'll go into it in greater depth on Daf Nun Gimel when we do that Tosfos. But let's pause there a moment and understand what the Torah has just done here, and taught us that the leftover blood So let's say in a korban chatas where you've sprinkled with your fingers, there's a whole lot of blood left over. And maybe in regular korbanot as well, as Rashi says on Daf Lamed Zayin, in regular korbanot as well, there may well be blood left over. And according to some on Daf Nun Gimel, there must be blood left over. You have to leave blood over because you need to do shvicha. Why? Because shvicha is part of zrika. Pouring the leftovers out is part of the act of sprinkling. It's part of the avodah. What we see from here is, and I struggled with this literally all night. Why is shvicha an avodah? I understand you slaughter the animal, you receive the blood, kabbalah, you molich the blood, you take the blood to the mizbeach, and then you do zrika, and that's atonement. Now you're left over with blood. Says the Torah, what you left over with, you pour out. Why is that zrika? Why is that part of the service? What are you doing? Why are you elevating the leftovers to this level? And therein lies the whole issue. We undermine leftovers, and we think leftovers are just to be discarded. Well, aren't they? And I thought to myself overnight, no, leftovers have something quite special to them. If you think about the blood that the Kohen carries from the bull or the sheep or whoever to the mizbeach, he's got a container of blood. He takes his fingers and he sprinkles a bit of blood. That blood is elevated to the highest levels of kedusha and affects kapara, it affects atonement for the person. Amazing what that blood does. What about the blood that's left over? Every molecule of the blood that's left over could potentially have landed on the mizbeach. But it didn't. It didn't. It wasn't picked. It wasn't chosen. And I realized that's with so many of us. Any of us could potentially be incredibly great, but we miss it sometimes. We don't. Any of us could potentially reach the highest office, but we don't. Anything, any bit of food on our table could potentially be used to sustain our lives, but some gets left over and it just gets thrown out. The fact that it was potentially great doesn't get lost. You don't lose that potentiality because it's not actualized. There's an amazing understanding here, and you can take it further yourself, and Pastor will have time to take it further. That idea that when you have potential and the potential is not actualized, fine, the potential is not actualized, and maybe you don't have the potential anymore, but the status that you had of having had potential, that still stays. You see it sometimes, for example, like in American politics, somebody runs as a candidate and loses. They don't go back to what they were before. They've always got a lot of COVID. This was the guy who ran for president. But you lost, guy, you lost. Doesn't matter. I lost. I didn't make it. I'm Shirayim. I'm the leftovers. But I ran. I nearly became. I could have become. That I could have is very important in life. And we all need to be very aware of what we could have been and what we could be, because we carry that with us. Who we could have been. When we were born, the potential we had for our lives maybe was much more than we realized. We carry that with us. That potential is still there. There's still something there. Leftovers are never just leftovers. Leftovers always carry within them the potential to be what they could have been at the very beginning.